This lecture is titled Space for Sisterhood, and the activist tool is the Leaderless Collective. I want us to think during this lecture about what an activist space is or what a feminist space is. I think a lot of times in activist circles, we try to make sure that we're working in spaces that are fundamentally different from spaces of government, of school systems, all those spaces where women feel oppressed, where the hierarchies of gender, race, and class seem to be operating against us. And so, but that's really a fundamental challenge for women's organizing is how do we create a space that's different from the rest of the world, right? How do we work differently? And we really want to, I think, live our values down to in the way that we relate to each other and in the way that we organize, not just to stand up for a cause, but to actually really look at what goes on within movements. And so, one of the, I think, fundamental um, difficulties of the women's movement or women's movements, if we can't even say that there is one women's movement, is how can we work toward a global women's movement that does represent the concerns of all women, right? Feminism means very different things to different groups of women. And there are really significant inequalities among women across the globe and among their organizations. Um, Depending on how much power you have within your home country's government, you will be more or less successful. Depending on how powerful your country's government is, you will be more or less successful in really influencing women's lives. And the thing is that this actually occurs on almost every level. It even occurs within activist groups that are supposed to be different. We find ourselves working in a lot of the same ways, using the same hierarchical structures where one person is in charge and everybody else has to follow what they do. And where ultimately it's not a democracy, it's a power play. It's about who's in power, and those people make the decisions. And so the challenge for feminist organizing is how do we organize ourselves so that we actually share power equally among us, especially given that there are so many social, given that our social reality, um, we carry that with us into activist groups. We can't just say, we can't necessarily just say, we don't believe in racism, therefore it doesn't exist in our groups. We can't necessarily say we don't believe in elitism, therefore it doesn't exist in our groups. We know that that within feminist groups, very often those dynamics will come in because of how unconscious they are, and because of how ubiquitous they are in the rest of society. And so the answer by early feminists was this structure, was to really dismantle any hierarchical structure within their organizations at all. They believed that hierarchical power relations are the root of all oppression. Um, so and and that we really need to fundamentally have a non-hierarchical society, and that's the way that we want to work also. They were also coming off of an experience where women were very marginalized by the male hierarchies within the anti-war and civil rights movements. So when you talk about the sort of early women's rights move, or early second wave women's rights movement in the United States, that's who were a big fan of the Leaderless Collective. That's actually what they were thinking about and what they were trying to work against was the way that they were marginalized in the movements that they had taken part in a couple of years earlier. Um, and I would say in general, feminism was very marginalized within leftist social movements. And so the solution for them was to create a non-hierarchical leaderless collective. And so a leaderless collective has a couple of fundamental rules. The first being that there are no formal structures of leadership at all. no presidents, no vice presidents, no secretary. There's no formal power. Instead, the responsibilities and tasks are all taken on voluntarily by the group. The group shares power, shares responsibilities, shares tasks. Decisions are made by discussion and consensus. So there's never any voting on any matter. The discussion simply continues until everyone agrees, right? You act as a collective, you have sort of one mind and one group. And that is, I think, a very big problem, because, at least in my experience, what often happens is that even when consensus is not necessarily reached, there's pressure on certain group members to agree, and so I think that that there are that with the best intentions in the world, there are some serious shortcomings to the model of leaderless collective. And two examples of leaderless collectives that that come to mind are the Red Stockings Collective. The Red Stockings Collective was the group that put together one of the first major protests of the second wave, the 1968 Miss America protest, that, as the name suggests, protested the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, and was a broader protest about standards of beauty for women. Activists through this is actually the protest where the myth that feminists burn their bras come from. It never actually happened, so the Red Stockings could not get the fire permit in order to set their bras on fire on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, so instead they threw their bras and girdles into a symbolic freedom trash can. So you will hear people say that feminists burn their bras. It never happened, they just wanted to burn their bras. Okay. And then the Red Stockings Collective moved on. It was very active in the early years. Moved on to the Abortion Speak Out in 1969, New York City Abortion Speak Out, and a whole variety of other actions. And then, but didn't really ever make it too far into the 70s. You know, as with many activist organizations, there ended up being a lot of personal disagreements. Some of the central people left to do other things. Ultimately, I think that part of the problem was that leaderless structure only worked for a short period of time and wasn't a sustainable model for them. And that there were, you know, not as many ways for women to work on their political disagreements, and those political disagreements often became personal disagreements, and that was a big problem for that group. And more recently, Occupy Wall Street decided to organize themselves the same way. I think as a reaction, and they were motivated by many of the same concerns, right? As a reaction to the extreme amount of hierarchy that they were seeing arising from wealth inequality in the United States, they made the decision to become a leaderless collective, right? They didn't want to have a corporate type structure with a president and someone that was completely in charge. They wanted everyone's voice to be equal. And as you'll read, one of the problems in that movement, and it's a very familiar story for feminist activists who were in the labor movement or working in civil rights or working in any way with the New Left in the 1960s, is that women were ignored, not given full participation, and the informality of that structure kind of allowed for gender to take over. So the male activists became the more important speakers simply because there wasn't a process. And I do want you to make up your own mind. I tend to agree with Joe Freeman's analysis that a leaderless collective simply invites all of these forms of power in, but not everybody does, and I think it's an open question that I'd like you to explore. And so as you make your decisions about whether you will work in groups or work individually on the final, I want you to keep in mind what sort of spaces we create for ourselves. And also we might think about what kind of space this classroom is, or this virtual classroom is. I hear a lot from women that they want to have safe spaces. And I think that in the same way that it's difficult to have a leaderless collective where structures of power don't have an influence, it's just as difficult to create a space that is truly safe for everybody. In my classes, I almost never say that my class is a safe space simply because I can't guarantee that. I can't guarantee that that it's a safe space. I can't guarantee that students aren't judging each other. I can't guarantee. I can't make any guarantees about what happens after class is over. But I certainly do still hope that this is something that we're committed to, and I think the desire for a safe space is really important. And I think that safe spaces spaces where we can actually hear each other and speak with each other more honestly and openly and formulate political action are important. But I don't know how we make those guarantees and how we create safe space. And I think the important question to ask when we're creating activist spaces that we say are safe is, who are we trying to keep safe? Are we trying to make sure that all opinions are heard? Sometimes disagreement is, quite frankly, unsafe. Intellectual exploration is not always going to be safe. I think you have to be unsafe to discuss difficult issues, right? If you are opening up a discussion about racism, white women might feel unsafe. They might feel attacked, but guess what? I think that that's sort of necessary. And so I'd just like you to think about when we do create these spaces, who is really safe? Who are we trying to keep safe? And ultimately, what sort of control do we have over our own spaces that we can even make guarantees that they will be different from the rest of the world? We all come in with our own social baggage, and I think that that it's very difficult for us to overcome it. I hope that we can, but unfortunately, I find myself ultimately skeptical. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about the dynamics of the Occupy Wall Street movement and about Joe Freeman's thesis. I will see you on the discussion boards.